Welcome back to the shed. Tonight I want to take a look at the 1958 Hugo Award-winning novel by Fritz Leiber, The Big Time. So this is a pretty interesting novel, and what I would like to do is provide a bit of a plot overview, talk to what I like because there was a lot that I really did enjoy in this novel, talk to some of the things that didn't quite hit the mark for me. I'll put it to the memory test and we'll rank it on our ever-growing sci-fi shed ladder. So what we have is a first-person account of Greta Forzani. And Greta's an entertainer and she's working in this place, in quotes. And this place is basically a recuperating station for soldiers of the Time War. Soldiers who have been either physically, emotionally or psychologically damaged. And they come to this recuperating station to basically come back up to speed so they can go back into the Time War. And what we find is that Greta is playing the role of really a nurse, prostitute and psychotherapist, helping these guys get back up to speed. What we also learn is that we don't really know who these opposing sides are in the Time War. We don't know what they look like, but they're referred to as the snakes and the spiders. So these two opposing sides have been fighting for what seems to be an indefinite period of time, utilizing these soldiers and these entertainers to recruit other soldiers and other entertainers to join the war. Now these soldiers and entertainers seem to span billions of years into our past and billions of years into our future. And we are in the little time, the novel would suggest. And this little time is where these people in the big time are playing their little games and tricks to try to alter the timelines. So it's a very interesting concept. So these spiders and the snakes are taking people, significant people in history, to try to pivot and change reality as we know it today in the little time. So very, very interesting concept. So what we find is that the main plot really revolves around these entertainers and soldiers who are locked up in this place, and they've just uncovered a weapon of sorts, a bomb, right? Some kind of time bomb. And what they're trying to figure out is, you know, who the saboteur is, how did I go about defusing this bomb, and ultimately how did I get out of this very perilous situation. So what did I like? Look, I found this book to be a very interesting novel that is going to be pretty difficult to rank, because I really like this idea, this concept of the big time and this time war, because it sort of takes that theory of the butterfly effect. You know, if you tread on a butterfly in prehistory, it's going to, you know, potentially change the course of evolution and we may never actually come to be, right? That sort of school of thought. And Fritz Leiber was in a very opposing school of thought where he thought, well, at least the novel would suggest, that time is not really, or history is not really that fragile, and that if we really wanted to make an impact to those timelines, we would have to go back multiple times and try multiple times and do several different things to actually have the effect on time that we would expect it to have. So it brings up some really interesting concepts and how they go back into history and, you know, kidnap key people in history like Einstein to have a knock-on effect on the timeline. So I found that to be a really interesting concept. I like the fact that we did span billions of years, right? Billions of years into our past and billions of years into our future. And I like the concept of little time, and I like that first person narrative. So really classic science fiction for me, really like the theme. And I, for one, really enjoy Fritz Leiber's writing as well. I'm a bit of a sucker for vintage sci-fi. I've said that many times on this channel. It's right in my niche. I did enjoy the writing. That for me was a really highlight for me. I like Fritz Leiber's writing. The other thing I sort of enjoyed as well is that the novel gave me that escape room concept for you who are familiar with escape rooms. And for those of you who don't, there's I don't know what you'd call them, apart from an escape room, but there are franchises that run these little sort of rooms where several people may go into a room and you're faced with a riddle, and the objective is to try to escape that room and solve all the riddles, because they sort of have a cascading effect. Really fun exercise actually if you've not done an escape room. Highly recommend it, but that's what an escape room is. And I sort of like the idea in this novel because it was akin to that escape room, right? These guys were in the room and they're trying to figure a way out of it and trying to find out who the bad guy is and how to solve this riddle. So I saw elements of that which I thought was really interesting. Look, it's also a very short novel. I think out of all the novels, all the Hugo and Nebula award-winning novels that we've covered to date, this is probably the shortest, and it was a very quick read. I think it's 127 pages, and you can knock it over literally in a day. So these are all the positive things I can say about this novel. So what didn't I like? Look, this novel had a really great concept, but I think that 120 odd pages just did not do that concept any justice. I wish this novel had been written in today's age, and this was a space opera of, 3 different books all being 500 pages long, right? Because the concept was brilliant. But unfortunately, where it fell short for me is that they were one-liners. Some of these concepts, which I wish were 50 pages, 60 pages, were literally one sentence throwaway ideas. And I thought it was so devastating, because I would just so love to have spent so much more time there. The other thing I would say is that the characters don't really go through any sort of character arc, right? We don't really learn about their backstories. I mean, we do to a certain degree, but again, it's very superficial, right? It's only 120 pages, so how much character development could you get? Because I actually thought the characters were interesting, but they just didn't get the canvas that they needed to really paint this beautiful picture for them, right? To take that bad analogy. So I thought the characters were a bit weak, and the weakest thing in the whole thing for me, honestly, was the plot. That whole concept around the bomb and trying to defuse it, finding out who the saboteur was, I thought for me it was a bit weak, really. It was just not memorable at all, which talks straight to my memory test, right? Look, I can remember very, very little about this novel. Even that wonderful concept I've completely forgotten about. Let me preface this by saying I read this book about 25, 26 years ago, right? So it's been a quarter of a century. I'm getting way too old. But, I literally forgot everything about this book. Even the big time didn't really prompt my memory as to what the book was about. Because those concepts, even though they were brilliant, they were just one-liners and throwaway. The characters were weak. I didn't remember any of the characters. I couldn't remember anything about Greta being an entertainer and what that actually entailed. And the plot around that bomb and that device and what happened there, I had zero recollection. So when it comes to the memory test, it's so sad to report that I just didn't remember any of this, which I think is a real good summary of my overall experience. Great concept. Too shallow, we needed more, we wanted more. So what about recommendations then? Can I recommend a novel like this? And look, and the answer is absolutely 100% yes. I really thoroughly enjoyed this novel, right? It was for me a classic. I loved it. I really did. I would still rate it a 4 out of 5. Very highly recommended novel, but I just don't think it stacks up today. It just would not have the same impact, I believe, at least. I may be wrong. I'd love to hear your opinions. But I just don't think it will have the same impact that it did in 1958 when it won the Hugo Award to a new reader, or a reader of the times, right? I think we're just spoiled these days with these ideas really being expanded on and really getting us along on the journey. Look, the other thing that I didn't mention in my dislike sections is that this book really suffered to, telling and not showing. Even all these great concepts that were there were really told to us, and they weren't even told to us. These people in the room were talking to each other, and they would say things like, oh, I remember what happened in Africa when we did this and that, and they'd all sort of have this private chuckle, and I remember when we kidnapped this guy and this other thing happened, and they'd have another bit of a laugh, and we were never actually shown. We were never actually shown any of these things, which I thought again was just a bit lackluster for me. I'm so disappointed. I guess in my overall recommendations is have a go. I think it's a great novel. I'd love to see someone remake this novel and just expand on the great concept, maybe make a television show out of it, because there are some cool ideas in here that I would just left wanting more. So look, highly recommended, right? It sounds weird, but I highly recommend it, because I think it deserves the accolades that it got, and I think it's got so much potential that it alone makes it worthwhile for me. So who would I recommend it to? Geez, that's been a long winding story, Pete. Who would I recommend this to? Look, I would say all your science fiction fans, right? It's vintage science fiction fans. I think it's still a great, worthy Hugo Award winner, and you ought to read it just for the concepts and some of the ideas, because it may spur some creativity in you to write a better novel one day. The other people I would recommend it to is, just recently we reviewed The Man in the High Castle. This has similar ideas, right, about time and alternate realities and what that may be. So I think if you like Philip K. Dick and The Man in the High Castle, there's some ideas here that I think would appeal to you. Up the Line by Robert Silverberg, I've talked about that book in the past. If you liked Up the Line, I think you would enjoy elements of this novel as well. And just generally, I think for brand new science fiction readers, I'd be saying, look, come in and see what our, you know, parents, grandparents used to think, right? But come in with that sort of mentality, and be open-minded, and I think it'll still be a pleasant read for you all. The other recommendation I would make is that if you're a fan of H.P. Lovecraft, I'd say have a go at Fritz Leiber, because Fritz was heavily influenced by H.P. Lovecraft, and some of the ideas and some of the concepts do come across in his novels. Not necessarily this one, but I'd say this is still a pretty good starting point for Fritz Leiber. Hey, we've got to rank this one. It's going to be a difficult one. Now, what I've done in the description of the video is I've put some further information on a weighting system that I've come up with that sort of I've always used in the board but hasn't necessarily been transparent. So I put that down in the description there, so you may want to take a look at that. But let me flip the cameras around and see if we can rank this one on the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. So back to the Shed Ladder and ranking tonight's 1958 Hugo Award-winning novel by Fritz Leiber. Now, if this board was the novels that have the most potential, I would say that this novel sits right on top. I thought the concept was just beautiful, awesome potential in this novel, but unfortunately I just don't think it delivered, right? Because I'd love to be able to say, let's start with A Case of Conscience by James Blish that won the Hugo the following year, 59, for A Case of Conscience. But there's just no way I could justify this novel on this place of the board. I would like to be able to say concepts alone may warrant a place on the B side, but there's just, even the concept, as wonderful and as brilliant as it was, were just throwaway items and things that we were told and never shown, right? And there was never really any progress or development in the characters themselves. So I've got to say, it would be unfair to rank this novel above anything else on this side of the board, on the B side. Which unfortunately, and as crazy as it sounds, and as much as I enjoyed reading this novel thoroughly, it's going to be somewhere on the bottom of the board. And again, for people who are big fans of this novel, this again just goes to illustrate just how wonderful all these novels are and how difficult it is ranking them, and hopefully make everyone happy with some kind of rationale behind it. But I'm going to have to say it's going to be somewhere on the bottom of the list. Is it going to be better than the 5th season? Conceptually, I even still think that this novel was a much better concept. It was much better. It was much better reading. I enjoyed the writing so much more than I did the 5th season. And the characters, as shallow as they were, I still enjoyed the characters more than I did the 5th season. And I was never bored through the novel. I actually enjoyed the novel from page to page. It was a short, quick read, which I can't say any of that was the case for the 5th season. So for my personal preference, it is better than the 5th season. The Falling Woman was a really interesting book. Again, I thoroughly enjoyed reading that novel. I sort of questioned whether or not that book was fantasy, because it was definitely not science fiction, and I questioned just how strong of a fantasy novel it was. And I came up with, I think it was 8 or 10 different bullet points that defines for me the fantasy genre, and I pointed out some shortfalls this novel had for my reading experience. So I'd have to say that The Big Time is better than The Falling Woman, because at least it was definitely science fiction for me, and that concept is pretty heavily weighted, and I thought it was an interesting concept. Where it failed was on the execution. So great concept, poor execution of that concept. The Einstein Intersection again was another one of those novels that sort of stretches the fantasy / science fiction genre for me, and it is very sporadic. It is very disjointed. It's difficult to quite understand what the novel is about and what it's trying to tell. You can do it, but I think it's a bit vague in that. It's still very good writing, but I think I'm going to have to give it to big time again in Fritz Leiber, because the concept again was just so good. I really liked the idea. It's just poor execution. We're here, the concept again, I struggled as well, if you remember seeing that video. If not, I'll link it down below. But again, I struggled with the concept here, which I didn't with this one. So I'm going to have to say, for me, it was probably better than the Einstein intersection. The Quantum Rose again is another interesting novel, because again it blended that fantasy and science fiction theme, and it was science fiction because it talked about quantum mechanics, and every chapter they talked to quantum physics. But it was also you know, a Beauty and the Beast type fairy tale. And I'm gonna have to say, as much as I had some things that just fell short for me in the Big Time, I'm going to have to say that the Big Time for me was better than the Quantum Rose. It was, yeah, this is difficult. Again, because I've got to say the Einstein intersection was definitely a much more memorable novel. Now, look, I'm going to renege. It's one of those days. I knew it was going to be difficult, but I wanted to take you guys along on the journey. And I'm going to have to say, I'm going to have to say the Einstein intersection is a better novel, because it is 100% a memorable novel. It was interesting writing. It did sort of question the concepts, you know, the importance of myth and how we define ourselves in many ways when it comes to that. And the Big Time, yeah, I'm repeating myself, I know, people. It's a great concept. I just wish you had it executed. So that's where it's going to sit. I'm pretty happy with that, I think. It's the disappointment. It's a real disappointment. So much potential. Don't you hate it when things that have potential never reach their potential? That's how bitter I feel about Fritz the Big Time. Hey, thank you for watching me struggle and ramble on, and I'll see you next time in the shed.